Hi, class. Today we're going to talk about more about the colonies and what life was actually like in the colonies, especially the way people basically made a living and the way the colonies were governed. And what we'll see is that basically there's a lot of difference between the way that the colonies are governed in the southern area versus the New England area. So the main idea today, or the essential idea, is that the southern and New England colonies are going to develop differently in terms of the social structure, uh, basically who's at the top of society, who's in the middle of society, who's at the bottom. We'll talk about how people made money in each region because it was different. Obviously, the South is going to have a whole lot more in terms of agriculture. New England's going to have to find other forms of money making. And you'll see some similarities and differences in the way that each region uh, tended to govern themselves. The reason that I am going to emphasize the differences later on is because these differences are going to ultimately plant the seeds for the Civil War. Ultimately, the South and its dependence on slavery, and the North and its basically lack of dependence on slavery is going to create division, especially over time once the states have been created, once post-American Revolution, and basically you'll see your Civil War as a result of these differences that were in place before the colonies ever became states. So I'm going to start off on the front page talking about the southern colonies. In the southern colonies, uh, the uh, the term southern colonies really means the Chesapeake colonies and all the colonies south of the Chesapeake. Basically, the Chesapeake colonies were the first of the southern colonies. They would include Maryland and Virginia, Virginia being the first, but also include North and South Carolina and a little bit later on Georgia. These states are going to go on to be increasingly dependent on slavery, and in this lecture, I'm going to explain why they became so dependent on slavery instead of indentured servants. Now, the southern geography was very warm, the soil was very fertile, so it was an excellent place for agriculture. Now, typically, whenever we think about slavery, we think about cotton, but the initial cash crop is going to be tobacco. And the reason that tobacco becomes so valuable is basically because much of the rest of Europe, especially England, is going to be basically addicted to the to tobacco, and so there will be high demand. And of course, with high demand for this tobacco, there is going to be more demand for land, which means you're going to need more land to take from Native Americans, which happens. We've talked about that. You're also going to need more people to both plant and harvest the tobacco on the growing pieces of land, hence the indentured servants and then eventually slaves. Now, if you look at the list of cash crops, you'll see tobacco is emphasized first. In some of the marshy regions of the southern colonies, like eastern North Carolina, you might have seen some rice being grown, and then you'll see cotton as well. Cotton is not the primary cash crop yet. That'll happen later on, especially with the invention of the cotton gin, and the cotton gin will be talked about in a later unit. Let's now get into the social structure of Southern society. Who is at the top, who is at the middle, who is at the bottom? At the top of the Southern social structure was the wealthy planter class. They were by far the smallest group in terms of population, in terms of number. However, they did own the most wealth, they did own the most land, and you'll notice that the notes say near the coast. The coast was the most valuable land because if you had land on the coast, it made it much easier to ship whatever crop you were producing overseas. So the wealthy planters, again, are the smallest group, but they have the most wealth and they have the most land. And because of that, if you remember, they also are going to have the most power because in the southern colonies, especially in Virginia, you had basically representation in government. You could run for office, you could vote for people in office in government if you had enough land and if you had enough money. And so, again, the wealthy planter class will be very small, but they're going to be running the show basically in the South. Of course, that's going to lead to a lot of resentment among a lot of other people uh, because they are going to, the other classes are much bigger in number but feel like they have an unfair amount of power. They have too little power in government. And that's going to really be manifested in Bacon's Rebellion, which will be very significant, which we'll talk about later on. Another thing that I'll note, and you'll see that here in the notes, is that there's this idea that the wealthy people could afford to educate their children. Now, in New England, you had a sort of version of public education. I'll talk about that later, but in the South, you did not have public education. Basically, if you wanted to be educated, you had to be able to pay for it or pay for a tutor for your children. The reason that is important is because basically the wealthy people also were the most educated, their children were the most educated, their grandchildren were the most educated. And the more educated you are, the more able you are usually to make a good life of yourself for yourself economically speaking. So basically, they are able to stay educated and able to keep themselves in power while the rest of the Southern society, whether white or black, can't afford education for themselves or for their children and therefore stay ignorant. And when they're ignorant, they're easier to control and they have a harder time basically advancing themselves in terms of having more land or more power or more political influence. There's an old phrase out there that knowledge is power, and the wealthy planter class knew that. So they made sure that they and their own were educated, and they used that as a way to hold even more influence and power over everybody else. Now, the biggest group in terms of population, in terms of number, is going to be the small farmer. So most people in the southern colonies were small farmers. Many of them, if not the majority of them, did not own slaves themselves. Most of the slave owners were in the wealthy planter class, to be honest. The small time farmers, they might own a slave. If they did, they might own one or two or three. They're not going to have these kind of stereotypical plantations with hundreds of slaves, which you see in the picture here. But they are going to be the small farmer will represent the biggest group, but they don't have a lot of power. They don't have a whole lot of land, but they get by. They're doing okay, but they're not doing obviously nearly as well as the wealthy planter class. What they're going to do is they're oftentimes going to practice what's known as subsistence farming. That basically is the equivalent today of kind of growing a garden enough to feed yourself, but a little bit more. So maybe it's like growing a garden to feed yourself and then maybe sell a little bit of extra crops to buy the things that you don't have, like maybe clothing or maybe a saddle for your horse or maybe a horse. So they're going to be farming mostly so they have food to eat and then they'll sell whatever they have left for profit to buy other things they need. They're not going to be super rich like your wealthy planter class. Now, at the bottom of society is going to be your indentured servants, the people that had basically gotten a ticket to the New World in exchange for labor, working for the wealthy planters, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and I have already talked about that before. But at the very, very bottom of the social ladder, if you will be the African slaves. They are going to own no land. Neither group is going to own land. Uh, and they are going to be working for the wealthy planter class. And eventually, you're going to see some laws getting passed to make a difference between the indentured servants and the African slaves, which is basically going to make an issue out of people's race and, in a sense, introduces racism into American history. So the indentured servants and the African slaves are both at the bottom class. Eventually, laws will be put in place to put the indentured servants up slightly above the African slaves and create a racial component to how people viewed each other. Slavery had been around for a long time in world history, but it's in the colonies and in the future United States where race becomes associated with a slave status. It was not always the case. So American slavery is unique in that it tied race to slavery. If you look at your notes, you'll see there's an arrow that's coming off of this last box because I'm going to say more about the indentured servants. And a little bit of this is a repeat from previous lectures, but that's okay. Repetition helps you remember things. So the indentured servants, again, were the poor people from England who wanted a new chance in the New World, but they couldn't afford a ticket to the New World on the boat. So what they would do is they would make an arrangement. They would sign a contract with one of the members of the wealthy planter class in which they would get free transportation to the New World, but then they would owe these wealthy planters, and they owed them quite a bit. They owed them basically 4 to 7 years of work. Now, they were given food, they were given shelter, and they were given clothing, but they weren't exactly treated very well. A lot of these indentured servants were, by today's work standards, abused by their bosses. They were not given enough food. They were not given very good food. They might not be given very many sets of clothing. And a lot of them are going to find out once they're in the new world that they've signed on to a very bad deal. And that is going to feed into the coming of Bacon's Rebellion, which is one of the biggest turning points in the history of the colonies. And again, I'll come to that shortly. Now, keep in mind that there was a system to encourage the wealthy planter class to bring the poor Englishmen to the New World. And it was rigged also to benefit not the indentured servants, but to benefit the wealthy planters. So the headright system, what it did, again, is it gave the English government would give wealthy planters 50 acres of land every time they brought over an indentured servant. So if you brought over 10 indentured servants, you got 500 acres of land. If you brought over 100 indentured servants, you got 5,000 acres of land. And that acreage did not go to the indentured servant. It went to the wealthy planter that brought the indentured servant over. So imagine being an indentured servant. When that happens, you basically are being brought over to work on somebody else's land, and then with the hope of eventually uh, getting a little bit of that piece of land once you finish your contract. And there was this promise that you would get a piece of land, but you can imagine that the wealthy planter class is going to have gobbled up all of the best pieces of land by the time you finish out your contract, if you finished out your contract. So there's going to be good results for the wealthy planter class, and that good result is going to be that they got cheap labor and free land to use that labor on. And so not only are they getting cheap labor for their growing plantations, but they're getting a lot of land and the best land to use this cheap labor on. And again, I need to mention, if I haven't emphasized this already, that initially the wealthy planters wanted to use indentured servants. Indentured servants were already in England. They could sign a contract so they'd have a legally binding agreement. And it was basically logistically, or at the time, it seemed easier than going and trading for African slaves. There is going to be one problem, though, regarding the indentured servants in the eyes of the wealthy planters, is that these indentured servants are still citizens of England, and they also have this sense of having the rights of Englishmen, and they're going to feel increasingly oppressed by the fact that they're not getting good land, by the fact that they're not getting representation in local government like the House of Burgesses, because they don't own land themselves, and even if they're finished their indentured servitude contract, they don't get very much land, and so they're still not getting basically votes in the local government. So the results for the indentured servants are that they're going to work extremely hard, they're often going to be treated badly, and they're often going to die before they even reach the end of their contract. They are literally, some of them, getting worked to death. There's a lot of resentment among a lot of the indentured servants because of this treatment. And then oftentimes, if they survive to the end of their contract, then they were still subjected to the fact that they didn't get good land. They might not get any land given to them at all, and then they might have to go off into the backcountry areas, farther away from society, nearer the Native Americans, maybe up towards the Appalachian Mountains. So basically, if they finish their contract, and that was a big if, because they might be worked to death. If they committed any kind of infraction, any kind of crime, they might have years added on to their contract as punishment. So it's a big if they're going to finish their contract. But if they do, there's not going to be very much land left for them, and the land that might be left for them might still be occupied by hostile Native Americans, or at least be right next to hostile Native American land. Now remember, the Native Americans, they've been pushed away from the coast by this point by the wealthy planters. It doesn't mean they've gone away, and they are going to be some pretty unpleasant neighbors for these indentured servants that had reached the end and gotten what was known as their freedom dues. So my point is that the wealthy planters are getting all the benefits, and the indentured servants are getting the short end of the deal, and eventually they're going to rebel. Now, I would recommend, for the last part of the front of this lecture, this first page, you might want to go ahead and highlight or put in all capital letters or draw little asterisks next to these boxes, especially the last one. Bacon's Rebellion is a huge deal. It is what solidifies the use of slavery in the United States. Well, in the colonies at first, and then in the future in the United States. So let's get into Bacon's Rebellion. First, let's talk about the causes. So the causes of Bacon's Rebellion is basically the fact that, well, first, the wealthy planter class is dominating the government in Virginia. By the way, Bacon's Rebellion occurs in Virginia. And at the time, the governor was a man named William Berkeley. The capital of Virginia was still Jamestown. And basically, the wealthy planters got to vote their own people into government or serving government themselves. And they basically passed laws that benefited them and not everybody else. Now, one of the things that they did is that they are going to basically pass laws, like I just said, that benefit themselves but hurt the small farmers, hurt indentured servants, and in fact, eventually they start to restrict voting rights to the point where you had to basically be super rich and own a ton of land in order to vote. So your small farmers, even if they earn enough money to buy a little extra land and maybe meet the old land requirement, well, the House of Burgesses is going to pass laws to make it increasingly hard to be rich enough to qualify to vote. So there's going to be another problem. Oh, and by the way, a lot of these small farmers were people that had been indentured servants and were now free, and were trying to make a living. And they were trying to make a living next door to hostile Native Americans because remember, the land along the coast had been gobbled up by the headright system by the wealthy planter class. The small farmers and indentured servants, who often were the same people, they are further inland, closer to the Native Americans. And when the Native Americans and the ex-indentured servants or small farmers got in a fight, the government of Virginia actually tended to side with the Native Americans. Now, why in the world would the government and the House of Burgesses, why would they side with Native Americans when they came into conflict with other Englishmen? You'd think that the Englishmen would look out for each other. And the answer is this picture here. So if you look at this picture here, what you're seeing is the wealthy planters of the Virginia colony, in this case, trading with the Native Americans. The wealthy planter class wanted to maintain this friendly trade relationship with the Native Americans, and if the House of Burgesses passed a law or sent troops to go fight against the Native Americans, then the wealthy planters wouldn't make money trading with the Native Americans anymore. So basically, the wealthy planters were turning their backs on their own people in order to keep trade with Native Americans. Now, there is another side reason to the fact that Bacon's Rebellion occurs, and that's the fact that there's a lot of frustration among the men. The small farmers, and especially the ex-indentured servants, were frustrated with the fact that there weren't very many women in the colonies that they could marry. Whenever you agreed to an indentured servitude contract, or you agreed to become an indentured servant, part of the contract usually said that you could not be married. You had to be totally dedicated for 4 to 7 years to working the fields, often the tobacco fields, for the wealthy planter class. The indentured servants were usually men. So, or almost always were men, if not always. And so, imagine being an indentured servant. You've put off having a family for 4 to 7 years so that you can have a new start in the new world. And here you are at the end of your contract, if you survived it, and there's no one to marry and start a family with. So for multiple reasons, Bacon's Rebellion breaks out. And part of it is going to be the major one of all these things that are listed will probably be the fact that they feel like they are getting the short end of the deal, and again, that they're basically doing all the work while the wealthy planters reap all the benefits. And even when they have conflict with Native Americans, the wealthy planters take the side of the Native Americans so they can make money off the Native Americans. So Bacon's Rebellion breaks out. Exactly 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion occurs. And I know this is on your key terms list. Take note of this. So in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon is going to lead a militia of very frustrated, very angry poor farmers, and they're basically going to make war. So this rebellion initially is going to target the neighboring Native Americans. So what Nathaniel Bacon first does is he leads this militia of poor farmers and angry farmers to attack the neighboring Indians that have been hassling them for so long. That's his first target. That is not his primary target. His primary target is going to be the wealthy planter class that has been hurting the poor farmers for so long, abusing them for so long, and wouldn't even protect them from Native Americans. So the next target, and probably the primary target for Nathaniel Bacon, is going to be the Virginia government. He is going to lead a rebellion against the government of Virginia. Basically, you have a civil war in the colony of Virginia. They attack Jamestown, they send the governor, William Berkeley, running, and they literally burn Jamestown down. And at this point, Jamestown is no longer going to be the capital of, of Virginia. I believe that it moves to Williamsburg next. Eventually, it'll be Richmond, but at this point, Jamestown is going to cease to be the, the capital. And basically, the government that had been operating in Jamestown, the House of Burgesses, run by the wealthy planters, they're getting some karma here for the way they've been treating the rest of the members of their colonies. And remember, people like Nathaniel Bacon, they believed in the rights of Englishmen, and now they are fighting for the rights of Englishmen. That's important to note because, as you know, I think I've said this already, is that whenever the American Revolution happens, a lot of it happens because people were rebelling against a government that they thought was not respecting their rights as Englishmen. Remember that when the American Revolution breaks out, part of it is because they feel like the Americans feel like the king and parliament are no longer respecting their rights. So Bacon's got a lot of momentum going in this rebellion. He's taken on the Native Americans and beaten them up. He's taken on Jamestown itself and burned it to the ground and sent the governor running. But then all of a sudden, he gets sick and he dies. And a rebellion that is this gutsy, that is this bold, that loses its leader, it's not going to do very well. Imagine a sports team when the star athlete gets injured. Oftentimes that team is going to fall apart without its leader. Or another way to think of this is that if you think of the rebellion as a snake, Bacon dying is like cutting the head off of a snake. So the rebellion is going to fall apart. The Virginia militia, official militia, headed by the House of Burgesses, is going to round up the rebels and execute those that they can find. And so the rebellion falls apart. However, the point that Bacon and his men were trying to make is heard loud and clear by the wealthy planter class. The wealthy planter class is going to realize that indentured servants are not reliable as a source of labor. They feel entitled to the rights of Englishmen, and they will fight back eventually if they don't get those rights. So if you're a wealthy planter, you're going to need another option. And that is the significance of Bacon's rebellion. So the major effect, and this is the part you really need to highlight, both in your notes and in your mind, is that wealthy planters at this point are going to start phasing out the use of indentured servants, and instead they're going to turn to African slaves for labor. Why African slaves? Well, African slaves are going to prove in many ways. Well, first off, they're going to be harder to get because they have to be traded for. You don't sign they don't sign contracts. They have to be basically kidnapped from Africa, and then you have to buy. They have to be bought from slave traders, so they're harder to get. But once a wealthy planter has an African slave, they prove much easier to control. African slaves don't come into the situation with this perception that they will have the rights of Englishmen. They don't come into this perception of having really much rights at all. They don't come into this situation ever anticipating in 4 to 7 years to be free, in 4 to 7 years to get land. They are going to be enslaved sometimes for life. Now, there were cases earlier on where slaves would be freed eventually. There was this notion that Christians shouldn't enslave other Christians, and if slaves converted to Christianity, the same religion as the Anglican wealthy planters, there was this notion that they had to be freed. You couldn't have a Christian enslave another Christian. But eventually that rule gets dropped, and eventually the slaves become slaves not for a time, but for life. Also, slaves were very much more easy to control. They were completely out of their homeland. They were in a place that they really didn't know where they were. And slaves were oftentimes intentionally picked from different areas along the West African coast. Usually they came from the West African coast, but they came from different areas. And these different areas spoke different languages, they had different customs, they had different cultures. And so the slaves were not really able to unify too well because they had cultural differences, but mostly because they had language differences. And so they were much easier to control. And if they wanted to run away, well, slave catchers could chase them. They didn't really have a place to run to. They could not obviously run back to Africa because there's the Atlantic Ocean in the way. So if they ran away, they would get lost maybe, and they would often be found and then returned back to slavery. There were some slaves, though, that did run away and they did find refuge with the Native Americans. Some of them would run away to Spanish Florida and find refuge there. Uh, in the end, though, in this last sentence is going to sum up the entire first page of this lecture, the biggest point at least, and that is that in the end, the Southern economy is going to be dependent on farming. It's going to be dependent on agriculture. At this point, it's going to be uh, tobacco mainly. Eventually, cotton will be the big cash crop. And the labor source will eventually no longer be indentured servants. It'll be African slaves. So let me just read it to you for emphasis, the last bullet. The Southern economy would become dependent on farming based on slavery for labor. This picture here, for those that are curious, this is a representation of the first slaves ever arriving at Jamestown in 1619, which I referred to earlier in the course. Now I'm going to switch gears, but remember that the issue of slavery obviously is going to be an ongoing one. Now I'm going to talk about the New England colonies. So in New England, the geography obviously is going to be a lot colder the further north that you are. The soil is going to be a lot rockier. It's going to be a lot less fertile. You can grow crops, but you can't really make a living growing crops alone. I mean, you did see farming as a major occupation, but you didn't have a super wealthy, like, in the South, you basically had like your millionaire wealthy planters. In the North, you're going to have people that operate as farmers, but they're not going to get rich off of it. They'll make some food for themselves. They might be able to sell a little bit of excess. They're going to be like your small farmers in the South. You're going to have to make money. If you want to make a lot of money in the New England area, you're going to have to make it some other way. And so, even though you did have a lot of small farms, like I just said, that's not going to be the money maker for New England. The money maker for New England is going to be, or the money makers will be fishing. Cape Cod is called Cape Cod because of the fish that's called a cod. And so a lot of people make money in fishing. There are a lot of trees, especially in modern day Maine, that can be cut down and be used to build all kinds of things. You can sell lumber for profit. And there's also going to be shipbuilding. Shipbuilding is worth pausing to talk about. So the New England economy, again, partly will be based on the building of ships. There's a couple reasons why I'm going to emphasize this. One is that these ships during the colonial period are going to be oftentimes used to ship products that are made in the English colonies back to England or to Africa. The stuff that gets shipped to England gets put into English factories. It's usually raw materials, and then these raw materials are turned into manufactured products. The stuff that's sent to Africa will be sent in exchange for slaves. And that is, I'm starting to speak of triangular trade. I'll talk more about triangular trade later. One other thing to mention about shipbuilding is that the northern colonies are going to be very good at shipbuilding by the time that the United States forms. And in the War of 1812, which we'll get to later on, in Unit 3, the northern states have become so good at shipbuilding that they're able to actually take on England's very strong navy in some battles, especially in the Great Lakes. If you fast forward to the Civil War, the northern states are going to be the ones that are able to build better ships than the southern states, and the northern states are going to use their ships and their naval yards to basically blockade the entire southern coast and keep the southern coast from being able to trade with other countries for supplies. They're also going to use their superior ships to help take over the Mississippi River. So, in the end, this history of shipbuilding is going to help the northern states fight off Britain in the War of 1812, but it's also going to be a major determinant for the fact that the Civil War is lost by the South and won by the federal government with the help of northern states and their superior navy. Long story short, the New England area is good at building ships, and that's going to help the northern states in future wars. Because if you want to win a war, you need to have a good navy. And that point's already been made with the fall of the Spanish Armada. Okay, so let's talk about what the New England society was like. First of all, in New England, people lived in towns. They did not live spread out like you would see in the southern areas. And they lived in towns on purpose. More on that in a second. Notice if you ever go to New England, there are lots of small towns. There's lots of big towns. You've got Boston, you've got New York, you have and lots of medium-sized towns as well. So there's always been a history of towns in or cities in the New England area. So why do they form these towns? Basically, New England Puritans were nosy neighbors. They wanted to be able to watch over each other. They wanted to be able to make sure that everyone was going to church on Sunday, everyone was reading their Bible regularly, everyone was treating their husbands or their wives or their children well. And so a lot of it was basically this based on this idea that I talked about before, that if you can regulate moral behavior by keeping an eye on each other, then you can earn God's favor. And if things don't go well, then it might be because some members of your society are not behaving very well. You may have heard of the Salem witch trials. Part of the Salem witch trials was based off this notion that there were witches among the people of these towns, and if the witches were allowed to live, then God would turn his back on the people. So you saw lots of executions of people that were accused of being witches. So again, keep in mind that there's this very strong kind of connection between moral behavior and whether or not you earn God's favor, not as an individual, but even as a community. And I think it's worth noting that even today, in today's consciousness, whenever people look at those that are poor, oftentimes they look down on the poor as somehow being inferior or immoral and maybe not earning God's favor. And sometimes Americans, even today, when they look at the rich, they look at them as maybe being morally superior, and God's rewarding them for being morally superior with money. So you still see this kind of this tie even today between this moral behavior and having God's favor. The Puritans definitely believed this very strongly. So when you formed a town, the town was going to be centered around usually a church and a school and then a common place to do trade. I'm not going to talk so much about the marketplace as I am the church and the school. They are going to be kind of closely related. So the church and the school will be central to the towns, and you'll see a map shortly that basically shows you a sample of what a New England town might look like. So let's move on to that map. So if you look at this map, you'll see again the houses are very close together. That way people can watch over each other's behavior. The church is in the middle, pretty much in the middle. The school is pretty much in the middle. People had farms, but they didn't live on their farms. The idea was that if you lived on your own farm, which I'm pointing at here, you'd be too spread out from your neighbors, and then you might start doing things that God doesn't like. So people owned some farmland, because everyone has to eat, obviously, but they were housed very close together, practically on top of one of each other, in order to regulate each other's moral behavior. So if you look at this map, and you look at where the church is, if someone skipped church on Sunday, it's pretty obvious that people are going to notice. In fact, if you look where the mouse is now, this person at this house might stop by this house and this house and this house and this house on the way to church just to make sure everyone was going to church and maintaining God's good favor. Also, you'll see the school is very central. And I'll get to the schools shortly. So when it comes to New England culture, again, the Puritans are going to work very hard. They're going to see part of that as part of their religious duty. They saw laziness, they saw not being busy as sinful. They said that if you're not keeping yourself busy, then you're probably doing something wrong. You're probably being lazy and sinning. Uh, and so they are going to be very religious, and part of their religious beliefs is that a belief in hard work. Kind of a fun side note is that they did believe that exercise was necessary and good for their souls, and they actually did bring over early versions of, believe it or not, baseball and football. And they would play football, probably not on Sundays like we do today, but they would play some version of football and again baseball. And the idea was that it was good for their bodies, and what's good for your body can be good for your soul. And of course, they didn't believe in playing sports too much. If you play sports too much, you're having too much fun and you're not spending enough time uh, reading the Bible and doing God's will and working hard. But they did have space for sports. Back to the topic. So again, they did watch over each other's moral behavior. They used the town to do so. And now on to schools. They actually did have what you could consider public schools. There was actually a rule in many of these towns that said that once a town had 50 families, it had to have a school. What was the purpose of the school? Well, the purpose of the school largely was to create a society of people, most of whom were literate, could read and write. And you can guess the number one book that they wanted to be able to read, and that would be the Bible. Before I even get to the Bible, though, look at this sample textbook from the New England colonies. You'll see here where it asks very religiously leaning questions. Who was the first man? Adam. Who was the first woman? Eve. Who was the first murderer? Cain. It references Abel. It references lots of people that are mentioned in the Bible. There, if you look at the mouse, you see Jesus being mentioned here. And if you look at the right-hand side, people can learn their letters, but they learn their letters. For example, the letter Z. To remember the letter Z, you have the name Zacchaeus, which was a name from the New Testament of the Bible. So the reason that education was emphasized in these towns was, again, part of this effort to get God's favor. Literacy rates were very high in New England. In fact, they were higher in New England than probably anywhere else in the world. They were higher than the literacy rates even in the mother country, England. If I remember correctly, the literacy rate was around 90%, which is an incredibly high number for that time, probably more than double than much of the rest of the world, if not triple. And why did they believe in being able to read and write so much? Largely so that they could read and follow the Bible and what the Bible taught. Now, there were some people that read the Bible, like Anne Hutchinson, that I referenced in an earlier lecture, that after reading the Bible interpreted it differently than what the Puritans thought, and it led her to challenge the Puritan authorities and it led her to being banished. So, when everyone could read the Bible, they could be more religious, but you did also have the case of people deciding that they read the Bible differently than the Puritan authorities, and that could cause some problems. Now, on to how the New Englanders govern themselves. The general court's going to go away. This idea of majority rule, like with the Mayflower Compact, is going to kind of phase out, and you're going to have what's known as the town meeting. And you still see town meetings in some towns even today. So, in a town meeting, basically, the leading members of the town are going to get together and they're going to discuss every kind of issue under the sun dealing with their town. It could be minor issues, it could be major issues, but what they would do is they would discuss the major issues of the town. And again, if you were going to be a local official, you basically had to be in good standing with the church. Oftentimes, you had to be a church member. Eventually, what you'll see though is that a lot of these initial Puritans, their kids aren't as religious, so they start to lower the religious standard of being part of the government. You might, and what they called was the halfway covenant, and basically what happened there is that you, if you weren't an official church member by being saved, but you were basically still attending church and you were the son or the daughter of a church member, you might still be considered kind of if you will, halfway saved. And if you are a son, then that might give you a ability to have some say in government. They start to lower the religious bar in order to allow more people to attend these town meetings. On the other side, if you go back down to the southern government, you're going to have a lot less people being involved in government because literally people live far apart. Unless you had lived in Jamestown or one of the coastal towns, you're living pretty far apart, pretty spread out. And even if you wanted to meet with other people in your colony to make government decisions, it would have been a really big hassle to leave your small farm to go meet and make government decisions. And if you're a farmer, if you're from a farming family, you know that farming is pretty much a 24/7 job and that you can't afford to leave your farm very long. So in the South, you're going to see the House of Burgesses and things like that, but a lot less people will be involved in government, partly because of the property qualification, but also because people live so far apart that they weren't able to make it to a lot of these uh, government functions, even if they qualified to vote. Now, the important thing to note, and you should probably highlight this one or put an asterisk next to it, a little star next to it, is that town meetings are going to give the residents of the towns a feeling of self-government. So you see me underlining it with a mouse here. This idea of self-government, I'm coming back to that. Here again, I'm planting a seed related to the American Revolution. The more that these people get used to making their own decisions, the more they're going to resent the idea of a decision coming from the king or parliament overseas. So again, there's multiple reasons that the American Revolution is going to occur, and you can already see it coming even at this point. Uh, the belief in the rights of Englishmen is going to be one reason, and the belief in self-government will be another major reason why the American colonists are going to feel like they should have a revolution. Now, if you you might think to yourself, which area was the first to really want to have a revolution? Was it the southern area or was it the northern area? Both areas were used to uh, self-government, but this feeling of self-government because of the town meetings is going to be a lot stronger in the New England colonies. And so whenever the king and parliament start to issue laws that they don't like, they're going to resent it more. And all of the colonies had this idea that they had the rights of Englishmen. And basically, whenever England starts passing more restrictive laws, these laws are going to affect the New England area more, especially people in Boston. So Boston is going to be the place where people are most used to self-government and also most offended by English laws that get passed later on that seem to violate their rights of self-government and the rights of Englishmen. So here I'm planting seeds for the American Revolution. Let me also now plant some seeds for the Civil War because that will be the major focal point of this class going forward. So here you see a depiction of the Civil War. Why am I showing that in Unit 1? Well, again, you're already planting the seeds or setting the stage for the Civil War even during the colonial period. So one reason that the Civil War is going to happen is because the geography of the northern and southern parts of the American colonies is very different. So it's kind of interesting to think, what if the Puritans on the Mayflower, or excuse me, the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, what if they had landed in Virginia? Then you wouldn't have these northern colonies that were so different from the southern colonies, and maybe you wouldn't have had this big difference between the North and the South that you saw later on in the Civil War. So by the time of the Civil War, the North is extremely uh, based economically not on farming, but on building things like shipbuilding, eventually also things like shoemaking, blacksmithing, and then in Unit 4, you're going to learn a lot about how we have an industrial revolution where we start to build factories. And these factories manufacture. Whenever you hear the word manufacturing, think factories, think building things. And of course, factories can also be big businesses. So the economy of the North by the time of the Civil War is very much business and factory based. Also, they're going to want the government of the United States to pass laws and have policies that are pro business and pro manufacturing, pro factory. Will they need slaves for this? No, the answer is going to be no, because manufacturing and business makes enough money to where you can actually pay for workers, so that by the time you get to the Civil War, the North has gotten rid of slavery. A lot of them thought that it was immoral to have slavery. They thought that if they should be able to govern themselves, that people should be able to govern themselves, and they're going to believe that blacks as well as whites should be able to govern themselves. Well, sometimes that's kind of a misstatement. It depends on which northern state you live in, but they are not going to need slaves because they can afford to pay workers. Not very much, but they don't need slavery to survive. In the South, farming doesn't make enough money to where you can pay for your workers that much, and they're going to much more need that free labor. So, uh, if you go down now in the box to where it says South, you'll see that the South again has an economy based on agriculture. And by the time of the Civil War, by the way, if you look at the map now, this is about what the states look like at the time of the Civil War. These are your northern states that did not allow slavery. These are your southern states that very much defended and wanted to keep slavery. There are going to be some states further west that aren't shown in this map, but this gives you the main idea of the main states that are going to be involved in the Civil War. So if you look at the South, there's your southern states, and they are going to be very much addicted to agriculture, economically speaking. In other words, they had to have agriculture to make a living. And by the time of the Civil War, it's totally or almost totally based off of cotton. And they wanted the government to pass laws that were pro agriculture. And it's going to turn out that the northern states, the laws that they wanted that were pro business and pro factory, are going to be laws that actually ended up hurting agriculture. And I'll explain that later on. The southern states are going to eventually resent the northern states, because the northern states, because of their town, because of the fact that these uh, people with a Puritan background are having a lot of kids, these states are going to have more population than the southern states, and therefore they're going to have more control of the government. And eventually the southern states are going to feel like they have no say in government anymore because the North gets their way every time, and they're going to decide to try to break away, and the Civil War happens. Obviously, the southern states, if they're based on agriculture and cotton, they're going to need slave labor. Cotton would not be profitable for the wealthy planters if they had to pay their workers. They had to have basically free labor. If they had to pay for their workers, then the southern economy, they felt, would collapse. So, at least partly because of geography, there's going to be increasing tension between the northern part of the colonies and future states and the southern part. And what you're going to see is that the northern states eventually are going to care more about what is good for them than what's good for the country as a whole. And the southern states are going to care more about what's good for their region instead of the country as a whole. That idea of caring more about your part of the country instead of the country as a whole is there's a word for that, and that's sectionalism, which right now you don't have to write down, but you'll definitely need to know it, so it might be worth going ahead and jotting down now. Uh, Sectionalism is when you care more about the section of your country than the country as a whole. And again, this tension ultimately will break the country into civil war. So the Civil War of the 1860s, you already see the seeds for it being planted, and we're not even at the point where the country is formed as the United States yet. At this point, the colonies are still part of England. But again, this tension eventually is going to cause the American Civil War. The sectionalism, basically what happens is over time, they're going to come up with compromises to try to get along, and eventually the compromises don't work. And in 1860, Abraham Lincoln will be elected. In 1860 and 61, you'll see southern states start to break away from the United States. On to one final topic, and this relates to many different regions, and that's going to be triangular trade. So if you look at your chart here, you'll see that there are three different arrows that form a sort of triangle, and that's going to be a triangle of trade going on. There's going to be trade going on between the colonies and between Africa, and between the colonies and Africa, and between the Africa and the Caribbean islands, and the Caribbean islands and the colonies. And honestly, there are multiple charts that you'll see of triangular trade, and sometimes, maybe even more often, you'll see the triangle go from the colonies to England to Africa and then back to the colonies. So there's really more than one triangle in this trade network. Uh, Long story short, there is a complex trade network that goes across the Atlantic Ocean between the New World and the Old World. And I'm just giving you one of the triangles of trade that occurs. So if you look at box number one, it correlates to the arrow that's labeled number one. And part of this system of trade, think of it almost like a three-way trade in a sports league. Oftentimes you'll have a three-way trade that occurs. So what New England is going to do is it's going to send, yes, it's going to send some of its goods to England, but the New England colonies are also going to send a lot of their goods that they created, that they built, or that they uh, basically distilled rum. They're going to send these things to Africa. So manufactured items, especially guns, are going to be popular in Africa. It gives African tribes power over each other. Rum is going to be popular for the same reason that's popular among a lot of people today. Uh, and so that is what gets sent. So New England sends some of this stuff to Africa. Sometimes New England sends raw materials to England that then get sent to Africa, manufactured goods, oftentimes guns and rum. In return, Africans are going to send other enslaved Africans to uh, not necessarily the colonies, the English colonies. Oftentimes they went to the Caribbean islands first. So if you look at box number two, you'll see that mentioned, and you'll see that the arrow is going to the Caribbean islands, places like modern day Cuba. And that's what's being shown in the picture here. So there's a lot to say about this, even though there's not a lot that I'm going to have you write. There's a lot to say about it. The West Indies, that was a nickname given to the Caribbean island at the time. It was called the West Indies because if you remember, Columbus thought whenever he went to the Caribbean islands that he was in India. So it maintained the name West Indies for a while. So the Africans are going to be sent to the West Indies, the Caribbean islands, where there were a lot of sugar cane plantations. This area is very hot and very tropical. It was the hardest of slave labor that I can think of. It was harder than harvesting tobacco. It was harder than harvesting cotton. It was hotter. It was more humid here. Uh, the treatment of the slaves was oftentimes very vicious. And beyond that, before they even got to this very harsh treatment, they would come across the ocean. So if you look at the map, you'll see number two. That is a long arrow across the Atlantic Ocean. And the slaves would basically be put in boats, and they would be put in these, they would basically be put in like sardines almost in a can. They would be stuffed into the boats. I'm going to check. I think I have a picture coming up here. Yeah. I'll come back to the notes here in a second, but take a look at this picture. Look at how the African slaves would be put in place. By the way, where did these slaves come from? Oftentimes, the African tribes that had gotten power from the manufactured goods like guns would use these guns to enslave other African tribes. So they were enslaving each other. And then for more guns or more manufactured goods or more rum or anything else that the Europeans or the New Englanders or excuse me, the colonists had, they would exchange slaves for these goods. So you have a very nasty thing known as the slave trade that occurs, the international slave trade. And if you look here, you can see how densely the slaves were packed into these ships. In fact, this might be a kinder picture than what the reality was. Oftentimes, it doesn't show it here, but oftentimes, if you were chained down below decks in these ships, you were chained so close together that your head would be not at the feet of the person, like you see here in the pictures. You wouldn't have your head at the feet of the people above you. You might have your head between the knees or almost to the crotch of the person in front of you. Why? Because if you do that, you can cram more people into the boat. And you would be there for days. And yes, people would use the bathroom. And yes, it would not get cleaned up. And it might end up, the person above you might, their human waste might end up on you. Disease is going to be terrible. The breathing conditions are going to be terrible, and a high percentage of people did not survive this voyage on what was known as the Middle Passage. So now back to the mentioning of the Middle Passage. You had to be very strong to survive the Middle Passage trip. I just explained why. And even if you survived it, by the way, many of these slaves, every once in a while, they'd be allowed up to the top deck in order to get a little bit of fresh air, and many of them would run to the edge of the ship and jump off and intentionally drown because drowning was preferred to continuing on through the Middle Passage or continuing on to be slaves. Okay, so if you survive the Middle Passage, if you survive this very difficult journey, then you had to go and work in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean islands, which was incredibly difficult. However, if you were that physically strong, you were also considered economically very valuable as a slave. So a lot of the American slaves that were sold from the Caribbean to the colonies, they were the ones that had proven basically to be the strongest. And so I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit. I'll get more to these slaves being shipped to the English colonies in a minute. These sugar plantations, one of the things that they're producing is sugar and molasses, and sugar especially is needed in the process of creating rum. And ultimately this rum is going to go to the colonies, but also back to Africa. Now, back to the idea of being strong. So it's almost like a sick form of Darwinism that you may have learned about in your biology classes if you've taken biology, this idea of survival of the fittest. The people that survived the Middle Passage, the people that survived working on the sugar plantations, they were considered the physically and maybe mentally strongest of all the slaves, and therefore they were worth a lot of money. And then they, in turn, would be sent oftentimes to the colonies as very valuable slaves that were known to be able to survive very hard work, long work, harsh conditions, were not likely to die as a result of being worked too hard. And I will talk a whole lot more about the conditions of slaves and what they endured and how they tried to sometimes fight back. I'll talk about that in a later lecture. But just note that slavery is nasty basically from the get-go. Okay, so like I said, this triangle that you're looking at is not the only triangle. There were other versions of triangular trade, and so you could almost, if you want to, draw a line from the the Americas, from North America, over towards England, because a lot of that stuff that was made in the New England colonies was sent straight to England, especially raw materials, things like tobacco, things like things like lumber. In fact, I would ask you to draw a line from the uh, east coast of North America over to roughly where England is. And then you can draw a line from England and draw that line down towards Africa, because that would form another one of the triangles of triangular trade. Because England would take some of these raw materials, not tobacco so much, they're just going to chew and smoke tobacco. They're going to eat fish, but they might build stuff out of lumber. Maybe it helps them build guns, and then they can use that and sell it down to Africa. And again, these African slaves will be sent to either directly to the English colonies, but usually to the Caribbean islands. And one quick note, like I said earlier, you can see that this trade network really has multiple triangles. So in the notes, you see there's a triangle that I'm outlining here. But a lot of your textbooks, they'll go with a triangle that moves more along what I'm going to outline now, which is from the colonies to England to Africa, back to the colonies. So there are multiple triangles. It is a complex trade network. One other thing to note about this is that this trade that's occurring is going to make any city that occurs along the coast, like Boston, which is shown here, these cities are going to grow and flourish. They are going to become very wealthy. So your major port cities at the time, most of them are going to be in the northern part of the colonies, in the New England colonies. They're going to include New York, they're going to include Boston, they're going to include Philadelphia, and they're going to include Charleston, or Charlestown at the time. One thing to note about this is kind of a historical parallel. Remember how I said that whenever the Native Americans were concentrated into civilizations, into cities, it was easy for Europeans to kind of round up a bunch of them and conquer them. During the American Revolution, Britain's going to do, or England's going to do the same thing. They are going to put the hammer down on Boston and take it over. They're going to put the hammer down on New York and take it over. They're going to put the hammer down on Philadelphia and take it over. And even eventually they'll move south and take over Charleston. The reason that the American Revolution is won is that they were able to take all these cities, but they couldn't control all the rebel Americans, the patriots, between the cities. And I'll talk plenty about that whenever I get to the American Revolution. And that concludes this lecture. The next lecture will be the last one of this unit, and it's where I'm going to start drawing the connection between the establishment of the colonies and the rebellion of the colonies. So in the next lecture, I will talk heavily about what happens in the colonies that gets us to the brink of even considering a revolution. And then the entire next unit will be about the American Revolution itself.